Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's take a look at the topics we are going to discuss today. I have chosen 4 important articles for a detailed discussion for the mains examination, and we have few more articles that are relevant for our prelims. So let's cover all these 9 articles in complete detail. But before we begin, why don't you press the like button, share these videos with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also do head to our Telegram channel, because after the session ends, we have a quiz on these topics. So that could help you revise these articles again. The link for the Telegram channel is also in the description box below. So with this, let's begin with the analysis of the Hindu newspaper by looking at this article on page number 1. The article refers to Bhutan-China boundary talks that have taken place yesterday. Now this is a very significant development. According to the article, the 24th round of boundary talks between China and Bhutan have been held, with the Bhutanese foreign minister visiting China to meet his Chinese counterpart. Both the leaders have held discussions and negotiations to resolve their long-standing boundary dispute. And these boundary talks, the 25th round of boundary talks, it is coming after a long gap. See, China-Bhutan have this standing boundary dispute. And to resolve this, they have boundary talks going on since 1984. Until 2016, 24 rounds of talks had been held without any progress, without any results. But in 2016, following the 24th round of boundary talks, the Doklam dispute had come up in 2017. And as a result of the tensions that were built up in 2017 between India and China, involving Bhutan as well, it led to the disruption of these boundary talks. But in the last 1.5 to 2 years, China-Bhutan have picked up these boundary talks again. And it clearly appears that there is a lot of progress that they are making. In the last few months especially, China-Bhutan have held several rounds of expert group meetings and technical meetings have been held. And now at the ministerial level, the 25th round of boundary talks have been held. So there are several signs that China-Bhutan might be getting closer to a boundary agreement. And in fact, China has even pushed for the establishment of official diplomatic ties with Bhutan following this development. So it means, as of now, China-Bhutan do not have official diplomatic ties. So all these developments that are occurring in a very short span of time, they do have a big impact on Indian interests in the region. The topic is very, very important as far as India's national interests are concerned, because the China-Bhutan boundary dispute, even though it's a bilateral issue between them, it has a direct bearing on India's interests. The fact that Bhutan does not have diplomatic ties with China, and the fact that China-Bhutan have a standing dispute which they are trying to resolve, has a direct impact on Indian interests. So that is exactly what we need to understand in this article. Now let's take a detailed look at the nature of this boundary dispute. You need to be familiar with the locations where the dispute exists, the history and the background as well, and what progress has taken place in the recent months, and how does this impact India. We should also look at what is India's position on the boundary dispute, what kind of ties India has with Bhutan, and how these developments could impact the relations of India with Bhutan. Now, if you look at the map, it depicts the boundary dispute between China and Bhutan. This boundary, which is more than 400 kilometers in the Himalayan belt, it is largely not demarcated, because China-Bhutan started sharing this boundary after China annexed Tibet in 1950. When China forcefully annexed Tibet in 1950, that is when the PRC, the People's Republic of China, started sharing these direct boundaries with Bhutan. Now, if you look at this undemarcated boundary, which has been challenged by China, there are 3 places specifically where the dispute exists. Towards the west of the border, you have the Doklam region or the Doklam Plateau, located at the tri-junction of India, China and Bhutan, where Sikkim meets with Bhutan and the Chumbi Valley of Tibet. That is where the Doklam region is located, which is disputed. Towards the northern section of this border, you have two more locations called Jakarlung and Pasamlung. Jakarlung is also known as Jamparlung. They both refer to the same places. So these are the two disputed locations along the northern section of the boundary. So apart from these primary disputes, the whole boundary line itself is not demarcated. So there is no clarity over here as to where Bhutan lies and where China lies exactly. So this has been a long-standing dispute between the two countries. Now, how does this dispute concern India? What does India have to do with this? See, India has everything to do with this boundary dispute because even India and China share a similar disputed boundary. As China annexed Tibet in 1950 and overnight became neighbors of these Himalayan countries, India has been concerned about China's aggressive expansionist behavior. In fact, back then, even Nepal, Bhutan, and as well as Sikkim, which was yet to join the Indian Union, which was still a protectorate state, even these small Himalayan kingdoms were equally concerned about China's aggressive expansionism. So naturally, the small Himalayan kingdoms, they sought India's protection. Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim, they sought India's defense and protection to stand up against Chinese aggression. Now, you all know about the India-China boundary dispute, how China has disputed the British era boundaries that we inherited and how it keeps challenging India and keeps threatening Indian sovereignty in the Himalayan belt. So, as a result of these tense relations that had started out after independence, India-Bhutan established a very, very strong friendship through their 1949 treaty. Through this treaty, Bhutan agreed to be guided by India in its foreign policy. Bhutan essentially outsourced its foreign policy to India, and in return, India committed that it will not interfere in the internal matters of Bhutan. India would not enforce democracy on a monarchy. India would not interfere with its unique economic model. We wouldn't interfere with its cultural systems and its political systems. So with this commitment, Bhutan outsourced its foreign policy to India. Now this was a big development, so that India could guide the foreign policy of Bhutan and protect the interests of both the countries. Because any adverse development that affects Bhutan's territory and integrity and sovereignty will affect India's security interests as well. So with India guiding Bhutan's foreign policy for several decades, India got that edge to determine the boundary negotiations with China as well. Under this agreement, India also took on the obligation to defend Bhutan against any external threats. So India, in a way, was responsible for the defense of Bhutan, and it is even today as well. That is why the Indian Army maintains a military presence in Bhutan, where we train the Royal Bhutanese Army. India supplies weapons as well to Bhutan. We even conduct joint patrolling of Bhutan's borders with China. The Indian Army and Royal Bhutanese Army jointly patrol the disputed border. But in 2007, this treaty has been revised and upgraded. As Bhutan wanted to independently conduct its foreign policy, it has asked for a upgradation of the treaty, and India agreed to revise and upgrade the treaty. And accordingly, Bhutan is no longer guided by India in its foreign policy. Bhutan's sovereignty has been explicitly recognized by both the countries, and Bhutan is no longer guided by India in its foreign policy. But however, India is still obligated to defend Bhutan, to play a role in the defense of Bhutan. Now, this is a very, very important point, because as a result of these close foreign relations, where India has been guiding Bhutan for several decades, Bhutan has been mindful of India's interests in the region, and it has deliberately not set up diplomatic ties with any of the P5 countries. That is, with the permanent members of UN Security Council, be it United States, Russia, UK, France, and China, especially China. Bhutan has deliberately not set up official diplomatic ties with them. This is out of concern for India's interests and to ensure India remains the most influential power in the Himalayan region. So this is the uniqueness in India-Bhutan relations. It's a model relationship. We have been very good friends of each other. There is a lot of trust in the relationship, where India has provided a lot of economic support and assistance to aid the growth and development of Bhutan. We have never interfered in Bhutan's internal matters. We have respected Bhutan's unique political, economic, and cultural choices. And India kept guiding Bhutan in its foreign policy until 2007. And after that as well, even though Bhutan conducts its own foreign policy, it consults India very closely. It keeps India in the loop whenever it has a major foreign policy engagement with any big power. And the most important point here is that Bhutan has still chosen not to have ties with the P5 countries. Even today, even now, even though Bhutan can conduct its own foreign policy, even now it doesn't have official diplomatic ties with any of the P5 countries, especially with China. So the only engagement Bhutan and China were having were the boundary talks to resolve the boundary dispute that was started in 1984 with the mediation of India. As India was responsible for guiding Bhutan in its foreign policy until 2007, India had played a role in establishing a channel of communication between China and Bhutan. And under this boundary mechanism, 24 rounds of talks had been held. 24 rounds of boundary talks had been held until 2016. Is that clear? India has another major interest here, which is the Doklam region itself. Apart from the commitments we have to Bhutan in our bilateral relationship, we have a major interest at the Doklam region, which is disputed between Bhutan and China. Now you can see here in the map where the Doklam region is located. The Doklam Plateau, also called the Doklam Bowl, it's at the tri-junction of Sikkim, Bhutan and the Chumbi Valley of Tibet. The strategic Nathula Pass of India in Sikkim is barely around 50 to 80 kilometers away from Doklam. Right? Nathula Pass is a major military outpost for India, a border meeting point between Indian Army and the Chinese PLA. It also has a lot of cultural and economic significance. Historically, Buddhism has traveled through Nathula from India towards Tibet. It's been a major trade route. Even today, it's one of the routes for Kailash Manas Sarovar Yatra, which is a key Hindu pilgrimage that India-China provide for. So apart from the proximity of Doklam to Nathula, it is hardly around 100 odd kilometers away from the strategic Siliguri corridor of India. You can see this narrow land corridor of India, which is sandwiched between Nepal over here and Bangladesh over here. So between Nepal and Bangladesh, there is this narrow stretch of India. It's hardly around 22 to 60 kilometers wide. That is the width. At the narrowest point, it's hardly around 22 kilometers and stretches to around 60 kilometers. This narrow land corridor of India is the only link between Northeast India and the rest of the country. It's such a weak point, a strategic choke point for India, that it is referred to as the chicken's neck of India. Because during the 1962 war with China, Chinese troops which had made inroads through Nathula, they came quite close to the strategic Siliguri corridor. So since then, India has feared a possible Chinese military blockade at Siliguri, which could cut off Northeast India from the rest of the country. So this has always been a strategic limitation for India. That's why it's called a choke point or the chicken's neck of India. It's as vulnerable as a chicken's neck. It can be easily broken off. So as a result, because of all these strategic military considerations, India places a lot of importance on Doklam region. It is Bhutanese territory, largely under Bhutan's control, but challenged by China. So China has an obsession with Doklam because China knows very well that if it is able to control Doklam and have a military presence here, it can dominate over India. The Chinese PLA will get hold of a vantage point from where China can dominate over Nathula and as well as Siliguri, thereby threatening India's military and strategic interests. So that's why in 2017, when Chinese PLA was constructing an illegal road at Doklam in Bhutanese territory, this road construction activity was opposed by Indian Army. The Indian Army and Royal Bhutanese Army, which were conducting a joint patrol, they ran into a Chinese PLA team which was illegally building a road at Doklam, and they challenged the road construction that led to clashes between Indian troops and Chinese troops. They engaged in a fist fight, a hand-to-hand combat, where a lot of soldiers were injured on both the sides, and very quickly this turned into a military standoff, and the tensions escalated to a very serious level. For several weeks, there were heightened tensions between India and China, as India is obligated to defend Bhutan against external threats. And as the tensions continued, both countries started reinforcing. They started bringing more troops. They started mobilizing more troops into the region, causing a severe military escalation. All the established boundary protocols between India and China failed. In 1990s, we had worked out a set of boundary agreements to avoid such escalations from reaching a flashpoint. To prevent local clashes from turning into a war or conflict, we have few boundary agreements with China which were signed in 1993 and 1996. According to that, there are established protocols on how India-China should work out these tensions, how they should resolve the tensions through meetings between local military commanders and senior military commanders. But these talks between military commanders failed completely, leading to continuation of the tensions, and finally, the leaders, Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping, had to get involved. And at the Wuhan informal summit, that is where both the leaders agreed to de-escalate and disengage from the region. So following these heightened period of tensions, the Wuhan informal summit provided for a temporary resolution for the military standoff between India and China. So since then, Doklam has been a flashpoint, and India knows very well that China has kept its eyes on Doklam. Now, this is the reason why India becomes deeply concerned about the boundary talks between China and Bhutan. Because even recently in 2020, there was another escalation carried out by China. All of a sudden, it raised a new claim at Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary that is located over here to the east of Bhutan, very close to our Arunachal border near Tawang. We all know China has always been interested in the strategic Tawang region of Arunachal Pradesh because it provides strategic access to northeast India. It's also home to an important Buddhist monastery, the Gelugpa Buddhist monastery, which plays a big role in Tibetan politics, in Tibetan Buddhist politics. So China wants to keep an eye on Tibetan Buddhist activities, and it has always been very, very interested in Tawang region as well. So very close to Tawang and Arunachal Pradesh border with Bhutan, at the Sakteng Sanctuary, Wildlife Sanctuary, China raised a new dispute which had never been brought up since 1984. I told you, right, since 1984, 24 rounds of talks had been held. But not for once China had brought up the Sakteng issue. But all of a sudden in 2020, it was raising a new issue at a time when the Ladakh clashes had already broken out. When the recent Ladakh clashes had started in 2020, right, by April-May 2020, India and China were already involved in a standoff in Ladakh, in the western sector. Parallelly, China triggered another front, deliberately triggered another front with Bhutan to put strain on India-Bhutan relations. Now, India believes that China is doing this. It is putting pressure more at Doklam, raising these new disputes, pushing Bhutan for an early settlement of the boundary dispute, mainly because China wants an exchange. By pressurizing Bhutan more and more, it's trying to distance Bhutan from India, and also it's trying to push Bhutan to agree for a territorial exchange. And what is the exchange? China wants hold over Doklam. In return, it is willing to give up its claims on Jakarlung and Pasamlung. This is the controversial exchange that China is apparently proposing. Indian strategic experts believe that China has this intention in mind, to push Bhutan to the corner, put more and more pressure on Bhutan as it's a small country that will create a distance between India-Bhutan relations. Bhutan will feel, why should it get caught and involved between the two large Asian powers? So this might create a distance between India and Bhutan, and it might force Bhutan to agree for an exchange where it will give up claims on Doklam, allowing China to control and dominate Doklam, as it is more vital for China in order to exert pressure on India at Nathula and Siliguri. So this is what India is worried about. If Bhutan were to agree for such an exchange, where it will get hold of Jakarlung and Pasamlung, where China will give up these claims, and in return give up Doklam to China, that is a nightmare for India, because any Chinese control of Doklam could be seen as a strategic setback for India. So it's in this context that the ongoing boundary talks become very, very important. After several years of gap because of the Doklam tensions and clashes, the boundary talks were resumed recently. The 13th expert group meeting was held just a couple of months ago, and they even set up a joint technical team on the delimitation of the China-Bhutan boundary. they had agreed to take forward the three-step roadmap, which they have finalized in 2021 to find a final solution for the boundary dispute. Under the three-step roadmap, China and Bhutan have agreed to fast-track the boundary talks, including the expert group meetings between officials, and even to conduct joint technical surveys on the ground, to visit the border locations, conduct technical surveys on the ground, and to agree upon a delimitation which will lead to the demarcation of this boundary. So China and Bhutan have fast-tracked this process. They have held multiple rounds of expert group meetings, and the technical teams are also meeting regularly. And they are committed in August to hold the 25th boundary talks as soon as possible between the two foreign ministers. So accordingly, the other day, the 25th boundary talks have been held, where Bhutan's foreign minister has visited China and met with his Chinese counterpart. In these boundary talks, both the sides have agreed to take forward the process. They've signed a cooperation agreement as well to initiate the work of the joint technical team to demarcate the boundary. So clearly, significant progress has been made, and that is very evident from the outcome of the meeting. Now, China has even expressed hope that with the resolution of the boundary dispute, which might happen in the coming months, it wants to have official diplomatic relations with Bhutan. It wants to reverse Bhutan's policy of not having ties with the P5 countries and set up official ties with Bhutan. Now, all these developments, they are definitely of concern for India. China has said, if diplomatic relations are set up, it is ready to work in all the areas to improve economic relations, promote trade opportunities, promote cultural relations and tourism as well. Now, this opening, if China were to get this opening into Bhutan, this could severely undermine Indian influence. Because we have seen this happening in many neighboring countries, be it Nepal, be it Maldives, be it Sri Lanka. Across the South Asian neighborhood, China has been able to undercut and undermine Indian influence by establishing close ties with our neighbors. So this could pose a strategic threat, a security threat for India. So India has always said we closely follow the boundary talks going on between China and Bhutan. At one point we were guiding the boundary talks, but now as Bhutan conducts its own foreign policy, right, India only observes the boundary talks, follows them closely, and Bhutan also provides updates to India. But as of now, India has not commented on the latest boundary talks. But definitely there is a concern amongst Indian experts and within the government that will there be a swap arrangement? Will they agree for an exchange? Right? That is the exchange of Doklam with Jakarlung and Pasamlung. Will China get hold of Doklam by pressurizing Bhutan, where Bhutan will be given Jakarlung and Pasamlung valleys in return for Chinese control over Doklam? So this remains our biggest concern and fear because of its proximity to Siliguri, which is our only connect to Northeast India. Is that clear? But however, you should also note that Bhutan is very close to India, very trustworthy partner. Bhutan has never compromised Indian security interests and strategic interests. It has always kept India informed before taking any major decisions in foreign policy. So one should hope that this strong relationship will continue, and accordingly, India will be able to protect its core interests in the region. So this is an important topic that you need to watch out for. In the coming months, definitely there will be more progress, and maybe China-Bhutan might settle their boundary dispute permanently. So that is something you need to watch out for. Next, on page number 6, we have an important column related to India-Canada relations. It focuses on the Indian diaspora in Canada, how their well-being is being compromised as a result of the ongoing tensions in the India-Canada relationship. That is the focus of the article. Now, the topic is obviously very important for international relations. It not only deals with India-Canada ties, it also deals with the well-being of the Indian community, the Indian diaspora in Canada. So one can expect a mains question or even a prelims question on this topic. I'm sure all of you know as to why there are tensions in India-Canada relations. We have covered this topic in our Hindu analysis multiple times. There has been a clear attempt to revive the dormant Khalistani extremist movement, not just in India but abroad as well. Few radical sections of the Sikh diaspora in countries like Canada, United States, United Kingdom, in Australia as well, in Italy, even in Belgium, France, Germany, and many other parts of the world. Some of the radical sections of the diaspora have made an attempt to revive Khalistani extremism and Khalistani terror groups like Babar Khalsa International, Khalistan Tiger Force, Sikhs for Justice and others, they've all become very active in the last few years. This is something we have been noticing since at least 2010. Over the last 13 years, there has been an organized, proactive attempt to revive the dormant Khalistan movement, and India believes that Pakistan's ISI is again playing a role. In a way, this is a reminder of what had happened in 1970s, 1980s, when Khalistan movement was a major threat for India. At one point, Khalistan movement in Punjab and as well as abroad amongst some radical sections of the Sikh diaspora presented one of the biggest security threats to India. But India had managed to decimate the movement, wipe out the movement through harsh security action in Punjab and as well as abroad, along with proactive diplomatic efforts. So it was a success for our intelligence agencies, our police forces, and for our diplomatic efforts as well. By 1990s, Khalistan movement had more or less been wiped out. It had become a dormant movement. But since 2010, we have seen these proactive attempts to revive the movement, and you can see the outcomes in the last few months. There have been a lot of tensions in Punjab, along with several attempts to threaten Indian interests in foreign countries, particularly in Canada. Right? The Indian High Commission, consulates have been threatened, Indian diplomats have been threatened, open rallies have been held against India, glorifying the Khalistan terrorist ideology. Right? So all of this has affected our ties with Canada, as we believe that the Canadian government is not working with India. It's not cooperating with India to tackle these extremists. India has said Canada has given a safe haven for Khalistani extremists. It is not only tolerating them, but even in a way encouraging them. And India has said Canada has become a terror sanctuary. Right? So recently, following the death of a Khalistani terrorist, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was the chief of the Khalistan Tiger Force, he was assassinated in Canada by unknown gunmen, and the Canadian government created a major controversy by blaming India for his assassination. Right after the G20 summit, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he blamed India publicly, openly in the Canadian Parliament, saying that Indian intelligence agency RAW was responsible for the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Now, this is a very serious accusation which India has categorically denied. India has denied any such involvement. India has said we are not involved in the policy of executions. Right? We don't run such covert operations, and we have retaliated against Canada for bringing this blame against India without providing any evidence. So India has said Canada has become a hub of terrorists. It's nurturing these extremists. We have downgraded the ties with Canada following this. Right? Even Canada has suspended free trade agreement talks that were going on. India has stopped issuing visas for Canadians and the Indian community present in Canada. We ordered Canada to withdraw 41 diplomats to bring parity in the diplomatic presence, following which Canada has shut down its visa consular services across all cities in India, except for in New Delhi. So because of this downgrade in the relationship, which is the lowest point in India-Canada relations, visa consular services have been completely disrupted. Even the trade and the people-to-people relations, the cultural relations between the two countries have been compromised because of the tensions. So that is why the writer says, if there is any further delay in resolving the tensions, the strong Indian community in Canada will bear the impact. The writer is mainly focused on the Indian diaspora and how they are going to be affected, how their well-being will be compromised if the government of India and Canada don't resolve the issue and reduce the tensions and restore normalcy, at least with regard to visa consular services and the welfare of the Indian community. So this brings us to the topic of Indian diaspora in Canada. You need to know what's the presence of the Indian community here, what's the strength of the Indian community, how do they contribute to the relationship. According to latest reports, there are 1.86 million people of Indian origin in Canada. This includes the NRIs, the non-resident Indians who are Indian citizens, and as well as people of Indian origin and overseas citizens of India. So you can say roughly close to 2 million people of Indian origin, Indian community are found in Canada, which accounts for nearly 5% of the country's population, of Canada's population. Now, if you look at the Indian diaspora in total, which is spread out around the world, there are around 32 million Indians or people of Indian origin present in foreign countries. That's around 3.2 crore people. That is how strong the global Indian diaspora community is. So out of that, 5.8% are found in Canada. The close to 1.9, close to 2 million Indian diaspora in Canada, they account for nearly 5.8% of the total 32 million diaspora we have around the world. As you know, the diaspora community plays a big role in foreign relations. As part of soft power diplomacy and cultural relations, the diaspora plays a very big role. They act as the cultural ambassadors of the country, promoting Indian culture and India's soft power values. Right? They give us a natural leverage in foreign countries because of the influential positions they hold, because of the role they play in the economy of the host country. They also send precious remittances back to their families in India, which is crucial for the Indian economy to bridge our current account deficit. Is that clear? Also, a lot of Indian students, Indian professionals, workers, they find employment, they find opportunities to study in foreign countries. So this is what we mean by ensuring the well-being of the Indian community abroad. Ensuring that Indian workers, the Indian community, Indian students have easy access to visa consular services to ensure that all their essential aspects of welfare is taken care of. If you look at the student population, there are more than 2 lakh Indian students, which is a big chunk of foreign students in Canada. So it's important for Canada as well. The Indian students are bringing revenue. Indian workers are contributing to the Canadian economy. Right? There are strong investments as well between the two countries. If you look at the flow of remittances, see, India receives more than $100 billion in remittances every year. In the last 2 years, we have been getting more than $100 billion, which makes India the top recipient of inward remittances in the world. We have overtaken China as well. Out of the total remittances we get, which is above $100 billion per year, most of it, around 50% of it, is coming from West Asia region, from the Gulf countries basically, from UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc. But apart from the Gulf countries, the biggest chunk of remittances is coming from developed countries like United States, the European countries, Australia, Canada, right? They are contributing to a big chunk of remittances coming to India, which is crucial, as I told you, to bridge our current account deficit. Canada is indeed a big source of remittances. The permanent residents, Indians who have PR status, right? The Indian diaspora in general, the money they are sending back to their families is crucial for the Indian economy. We have a strong trading relationship, a decently strong trading relationship. India was Canada's 10th largest trading partner, and Canada was India's 9th largest trading partner. India does depend on Canada for a lot of essential imports, like pulses, for example, paper material, paper pulp, newsprint, and other essential commodities are imported from Canada. India has a dependency here. Same with Canada as well. It depends on India for several commodities, including IT services. There is a strong trading relationship along with a very strong people-to-people relationship and a strong flow of investments. There are several Canadian companies operating in India, Canadian nationals working in India. There are many Indian companies invested in Canada, having offices in Canada. Indian workers working for Indian companies in Canada. The Canadian Pension Fund, for example, is a major investor in India. Canada is a decent source of FDI, foreign direct investment, into India. So this is indeed a strong relationship. And right now this is being threatened because of the disruption that is taking place. Both the sides have a constant movement of students, workers, traders and investors. And there are a lot of tourists as well between the two countries, contributing to both the countries. Thousands of Canadians come to India on tourist visas. Thousands of Indians visit Canada as well to visit their families, bringing revenue to both the countries. So this important economic, cultural relationship is under threat. Now, if you just look at the Sikh diaspora in Canada, they constitute around 7.7 lakh out of the total 1.86 million, right? The Sikh community, some of them are Indian citizens, but most of them are Canadian citizens. So they form the cultural bond, they form the major chunk of the Indian community in Canada. But the Sikhs in general have a history of coexisting harmoniously with other communities. Majority of the Sikhs don't back or support the Khalistan movement. It's a few radicals, right? A few misled, indoctrinated youth who are backing these extremists. Majority of the community is peaceful. Sikhism itself is one of the most peaceful religions, right? The community has coexisted with the rest of the community in Canada. They have contributed to Canada's growth. They have contributed to India-Canada relations. But of course, the Khalistan movement, which does have some support from few radical sections in the diaspora, has had a huge impact on the relationship. We saw in 1980s how the ties were disrupted as Canada started hosting the Khalistani extremists. Right? Canada wouldn't act against them despite India providing evidence. These extremists would misuse sacred gurudwaras for their radical activities, and yet Canada wouldn't act against them. They would threaten and target Indian diplomats, the Indian missions in Canada, and yet Canada wouldn't act accordingly. So this has always been a source of friction, right? And one needs to remember one horrific incident that happened in 1914 during colonial rule. On May 23rd, 1914, you might have studied in modern history, a cargo ship, a Japanese cargo ship, SS Komgat Maru. It was carrying 376 Indian passengers. Majority of them were Sikhs who were looking to migrate to Canada, to Vancouver. There were several Hindus, Muslims and Christians as well on the ship, but majority of the passengers were from the Sikh community. They were looking to flee British India, seek a new life in Canada. Right? Essentially, they were fleeing persecution under colonial rule. But because of British-era colonial laws that mandated US and Canada to exclude Asian immigrants, the Indian immigrants were not allowed to land at Vancouver, and Canadian authorities turned back the ship. So, with no other port accepting the ship, Komgat Maru came back to Kolkata at the Badwater port, where the British authorities were waiting to arrest the Indian immigrants. This led to riots and complete chaos as the British police unleashed violence against the Indian immigrants, leading to the death of several passengers. It became one of the most unfortunate, horrific events during our freedom struggle. So Canada has even apologized for this incident. Under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, right, Canada has made a specific mention of the incident. How Canadian policy back then, influenced by British colonial laws, led to violation of human rights. It even released a commemorative stamp to pay tribute to those who lost lives in the SS Komgat Maru incident. And Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau even issued a formal apology in 2016. He had reiterated that such an incident should never happen again, that could affect our relations between India and Canada and also lead to violation of human rights. So Khalistan movement represents one such threat. Now, if you look at the global framework on migration, there is a global compact on migration adopted by the United Nations in 2018. In Morocco, at Marrakesh, an intergovernmental conference was held to deal with illegal migration, refugees, and in general movement of people around the world. And to provide for orderly, safe, and regular migration, the Global Compact was adopted by the UN. India, Canada, both are signatories to it, which means they have certain obligations to uphold the well-being of the migrants on both the sides. They are also members of the Commonwealth Group, where they are committed to upholding human rights and basic fundamental rights. Right? So, under the Global Compact on Migration, there is one goal that has been adopted out of the 23 objectives for safe, orderly, regular migration. There is objective number 19, which mandates the countries, the UN member countries, to create conditions for migrants and diasporas to fully contribute to sustainable development in all countries. This is also seen as an extension of Sustainable Development Goals. It's seen as an extension of the SDG Agenda 2030, which deals with migration, refugees as well. So the Global Compact on Migration places this commitment under Objective 19 on the countries to create ideal conditions for migrant workers and diaspora community, so they can fully contribute to sustainable development. So India, Canada have this obligation. That's what the writer is pointing out. Now, despite all the tensions they have, they need to work towards repairing the damage to restore the bond, because right now the bond has snapped. They will undermine the objective 19 of Global Compact on Migration if they don't work towards repairing the relationship, as this is already having an irreparable impact on the diaspora community. The tourists, students, workers, investors, traders, they're all getting affected, right? And this might very well result in more complex issues where the Indian diaspora won't be able to travel to India, visit India. Those who are OCI card holders, right? They may not be able to visit India to visit their families, which could affect cultural and people-to-people relations. Similarly, Indian students, workers could get badly affected. So that is why the writer is urging both the countries to fulfill Objective 19 of Global Compact on Migration. Is that clear? So with this, we will move on to an important editorial on the same page, which deals with politicization of the bureaucracy in India. It's a small article, but it's a very, very important article as far as polity, governance, and even ethics in governance is concerned. See, the Modi government has launched a new initiative. It's called Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra. The Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra. Under this initiative, the Modi government has directed government officials and even military officers. It has directed the civilian bureaucracy essentially, and as well as military officers, to promote the achievements of the government in the last 9 years. Is that clear? So the program will run from November 2023. It will go on all the way till January 2024. Now, government officials or military officials promoting the achievements of the government in itself may not be a controversial, problematic issue. But the problem is, the Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra is specifically focusing on the last 9 years of government's achievements, which means it is designed to favor the ruling party, the BJP. And using government machinery, using government officials, that to military officials as well, to conduct campaigns around the country with a clear political motive, marks the politicization of the Indian bureaucracy and, more dangerously, the politicization of the Indian military, the Indian armed forces. This comes right before the 2024 elections. Although it's not legally wrong, but ethically, morally, it could become incorrect. Constitutionally speaking as well, there is a grey area here. Because in the Indian Constitution, there is clear doctrine of separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. On similar lines, one of the core principles in Indian polity is that the bureaucracy and the armed forces, essentially the military, they are conceived as apolitical branches of the government. One reason why the Indian democracy has thrived is because, by and large, our armed forces and the civilian bureaucracy have remained apolitical. They've remained impartial politically without taking sides between political parties or without getting directly involved in political matters. This is a core tenet, a core ethical tenet of the civil services and as well as the armed forces. So under Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra, the Modi government is encouraging top officials, including joint directors, secretaries, deputy secretaries. They are being appointed as Rath Prabharis, someone who leads chariots. And they are being asked to hold road shows at popular crowded locations like shopping malls, temples, or airports, right? At such important locations, the officials are being encouraged to go, stand there and campaign, highlighting the achievements of the government in the last 9 years. As I told you, this per se may not be entirely wrong or illegal, but it raises these gray areas, right? These ethical issues come up here. Now, the concern here is that along with promoting the government achievements, the officials are encouraged to promote the people to take selfies, stand with the officials, take selfies with them, right? And clearly, this brings a political objective into the equation right before the elections. So the writer of the editorial team of the Hindu believes that this marks a dangerous politicization of our bureaucracy and military. Because throughout India's independent history, our civil services and more importantly, the armed forces have largely remained apolitical. They've stayed away from politics without aligning with any parties, never campaigning for elections, not pushing for a candidate in any election. If this is compromised, this could weaken Indian democracy. That is the core point being made by the article, by the editorial. So it is pointing out that the government is crossing a line, it's crossing an ethical line, and it's entering into this constitutional legal grey area where it is planning to use government officials, the government machinery is supposed to be apolitical, not be directly involved in political matters, in election campaigns, etc. Right? That is the reason why Election Commission of India or UPSC and other key constitutional bodies, they can freely function without fear, without coercion, without any threats, right? Upholding the constitutional spirit and values. That is the reason why the Indian Armed Forces have been able to function in a highly professional manner without displaying any kind of political inclinations. But such usage of government officials for conducting campaigns to highlight government achievements, right, will indirectly benefit the ruling party right before elections, and this marks a dangerous politicization of the bureaucracy and the military. Is that clear? So that is the concern being raised by this editorial. Coming to the next article on page number 7, we have an article referring to the disaster risk in the Himalayan belt. In the Himalayan region, there was a disaster that occurred recently in Sikkim. We have covered this as well multiple times in our Hindu analysis. There was a glacial lake outburst flood at the South Lonak Lake. At the South Lonak Glacial Lake, the glacial lake burst, triggering flash floods in the Teesta, in the downstream of the Teesta River, which led to large-scale loss of life, property and infrastructure in Sikkim, which turned this into a major disaster. So the writer is pointing out that the Himalayan region is ecologically very sensitive. It is highly prone to hydrological hazards such as floods and flash floods. It's highly prone to meteorological hazards as well, such as heavy rainfall, cloud bursts. It is also prone to geophysical hazards, such as earthquakes, which can in turn trigger landslides, correct? Which can also cause the glacial lakes here to burst out, causing floods in the downstream. So from the disaster management point of view, the Himalayas is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. It's affected by hydrological hazards, meteorological hazards, and geophysical hazards. So the writer is highlighting the vicious link, the cyclical link between various disasters such as landslides, floods, and how they are connected to other hazard factors like earthquakes or GLOF incidents or cloud bursts, etc. Essentially, these are primary hazards. In the Himalayas, there can be a high magnitude earthquake which can trigger a landslide. The landslide in turn can cause floods, because when there is a landslide, the earth material would come crashing down the slope. It will crash into the valley with all the debris, creating a natural dam, a natural blockage for the river. So behind this natural blockage, the water will build up, and eventually the blockage will be broken. The natural dam will breach, causing flash floods in the downstream. So these flash floods, where the water is flowing at great velocity, could further weaken the top layer of the soil, triggering even more landslides. So that is a vicious cycle. It's a chain reaction, a domino effect, right? It's a cascading effect that you see with regard to disasters. Similarly, cloud bursts that brings heavy rainfall. could increase surface runoff in the slopy areas, causing floods that could trigger landslides. And again, the landslides can trigger few more floods. And the same happens with GLOF events. There are thousands of glacial lakes in the Himalayan belt, in the Indus Basin, in the Gangetic Basin, in the Brahmaputra Basin. There are thousands of glacial lakes, and there is a greater risk of them breaching, which could trigger landslides and floods in the downstream. So that is the concern the writer is pointing out. He says that in the Indus, in the Ganga and the Brahmaputra river basins, we have a total of 28,000 plus glacial lakes. Is that clear? These are lakes formed by the melting of the glacier, the Himalayan glaciers. Due to the natural process of melting during summer, whenever the temperature rises, right, the glaciers which melt form these glacial lakes at the bottom of the glacier. These lakes are held, the water is held back by these natural blockages formed by rock and moraine structures. The rock or moraine structures will be holding them back. Moraine is basically organic decaying matter with the rocky material, which forms this natural blockage, acting like a dam-like structure that holds the glacial lake back. Now, these lakes have been mapped by the National Remote Sensing Center of ISRO, which makes use of remote sensing satellites and data. And accordingly, it has prepared the Glacial Lake Atlas for the country. The Glacial Lake Atlas has been prepared by the National Remote Sensing Center to map out the distribution of glacial lakes in all the major river basins. These studies, led by NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, the nodal authority for disaster management, has helped in identifying the most high-risk glacial lakes which are vulnerable for an outburst flood. In fact, South Lonak was one of the glacial lakes that had been flagged earlier by NDMA. Along with the South Lonak Lake, another important glacial lake in Sikkim, the Shakocho Glacial Lake, both were flagged by NDMA even before the disaster could occur. Several experts had brought out findings to show the risk associated with these glacial lakes, and NDMA had even started implementing an early warning system. The NDMA had deployed solar-powered cameras along with advanced sensors to collect vital data regarding the stability of these glacial lakes. Now see, the problem is global warming and the long-term climate change, which has been triggered by human activities, anthropogenic activities. It has accelerated the melting of glaciers. So this represents an enhanced risk for GLOF events. Plus, the Himalayan ecology has been over-abused and over-exploited due to haphazard urbanization, large-scale deforestation, and unplanned development. So these man-made factors are adding to the risk, and NDMA was monitoring some of the glacial lakes with advanced cameras and sensors, and they had indicated a potential threat at South Lonak as well. Higher temperatures were recorded with these sensors, which indicated that the glaciers are melting at a faster rate with high risk of an outburst flood occurring. Accordingly, certain measures were also taken. Few structural measures were taken up. Given the risk associated with it, few structural measures were initiated to hold the flood water, to divert the flood water. But none of the measures worked effectively because this is a very challenging domain. Monitoring glacial lakes, at such high altitudes, in such adverse terrain and climatic conditions, is not an easy task. And the lack of awareness in the downstream areas is another challenge, right? So that is why the writer is urging for the NDMA and the concerned authorities to effectively implement all the phases of the disaster management cycle. In the disaster management cycle, you have three phases essentially. You have your pre-disaster phase where you focus on preparedness, planning. You try to prevent the disaster if possible. You try to mitigate the impact. Then you focus on during disaster. That is, if the disaster were to happen, you'll provide for better response and relief. You'll try to conduct effective search and rescue operations and save as many lives as possible. right, and provide basic relief and aid material. And then after the disaster, you focus on post-disaster recovery to rehabilitate the displaced people, to reconstruct the affected areas. These are the three phases in disaster management. So the article is urging NDMA and the concerned authorities to focus on not just an effective early warning system, but also to create the right structural measures and to spread awareness amongst the people. There should be a lot of local awareness where the local authorities, the district level village authorities, the panchayats, the local urban bodies, right, and the local people are aware what to do when the risk is high and when the alerts are given out. The Central Water Commission also plays a role as it is the nodal agency to track floods, to monitor water levels in rivers and dams. IMD plays a critical role, the India Meteorological Department, as it keeps track of heavy rainfall cloudburst events. Right? So any of these primary hazards can trigger a GLOF event. Be it an earthquake or heavy rains, cloudbursts, they can all trigger GLOF hazards. In fact, the latest hazard that we saw, the disaster we saw at South Lonak, right? It is apparently triggered by the crash by a landslide-like event where rock and moraine crashed into the lake that breached the natural block, which caused the water to flood down the stream, causing the flash floods. Right? So sensors can pick this up. And if the alerts are disseminated in real time, and if there is awareness amongst local people and authorities what to do, how to evacuate quickly, then precious lives can be saved. If appropriate structural measures are taken to divert the flood water, to hold the flood water through check dams, embankments, etc., right? And through better zoning standards. If you have regulated all the construction, the urbanization, and human habitations through your zoning standards, all these measures will help in mitigating the impact of the disaster. We may not be able to prevent it, at least we can mitigate the impact of the disaster. So that is what the article is pointing out. So this completes my detailed discussion of all the big columns and articles in today's newspaper, and we head towards the prelim section. We'll take a quick look at the small articles in the newspaper. On page number 3, we have an article relevant for international relations and security that talks about a security risk along the India-Sri Lanka International Maritime Boundary Line, the IMBL. Here in this map, you can see the International Maritime Boundary Line, which has been demarcated. You can see the Indo-Sri Lanka Maritime Boundary Line, which was finalized in 1974-1976. Along this maritime boundary line, one big risk that we face is the presence of organized crime. Organized criminal activities such as smuggling and trafficking is very rampant in the region. And the concern here is that these criminal cartels might be linked with terror groups, especially the LTTE, which has operated here in the northern provinces of Sri Lanka, especially in the Jaffna region. You can see the Park Bay and Gulf of Mannar region, right? And across this maritime boundary line, we face a big risk where smuggling is a common threat. So the Indian Coast Guard, which is responsible for safeguarding the boundary line along with Indian Navy and the Coastal Police, they have arrested few fishing boats from India and Sri Lanka, and several fishermen from both India and Sri Lanka have been arrested for smuggling contraband. Contraband is basically illegal material which is being smuggled, which is being trafficked into the country. They have got hold of sea cucumbers, which is a threatened species, threatened marine species. It is protected under Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Is that clear? They were also smuggling turmeric. So such smuggling and trafficking not only endangers the environment, but it also threatens our economy. It affects our revenue, right? It's a violation of the Customs Act of 1962. So the Indian Coast Guard, along with the customs authorities and Tamil Nadu police and the intelligence agencies, have conducted the operation to arrest these smuggling cartels that were involved in these organized criminal activities. So this remains a pressing concern along the India-Sri Lanka maritime boundary line. You need to be aware of this. We already have the fishermen dispute in the region, right? LTT has made attempts to revive itself as well. That remains another concern here. So the presence of so many issues along the maritime boundary line, including the Kachativu Island dispute, right, the fishermen dispute, plus the presence of smuggling and trafficking cartels, with an attempt by LTTE to revive itself, they all pose considerable risk for India-Sri Lanka relations and threatens the security of the region as well. So that is something you should be aware of. Next, on page number 10, the Hindu reports that the Ministry of Home Affairs is going to introduce DNA matching and face sample matching at the level of police stations in order to effectively tackle crime. See, when the accused are arrested by the police in a particular criminal case, and eventually if they are convicted or even released, the accused, their basic details are collected by the police in the police station. Right? Previously, this used to happen according to the provisions of the Identification of Prisoners Act, which was a colonial law. Right? When the accused are arrested by the police in any criminal case, their basic details are captured, like fingerprints, footprints, their photograph, signature. Such basic details, including some biometric details, were being captured under the old colonial law, which is the Identification of Prisoners Act. Now, this law has been replaced by the Criminal Procedure Identification Act last year. The Parliament passed the new law, the Criminal Procedure Identification Act, which has replaced the Identification of Prisoners Act. So, under the new law, the police can collect, not just the state police, even central investigating agencies like CBI, NIA, etc. They can collect, store and analyze physical and biological samples of the accused. They can collect biometrics. They can collect DNA samples, including retinal iris scan, facial profile, which can be further used for facial recognition technology. Right? So such profiling can be done by the police right now as per the provisions of the Criminal Procedure Identification Act. Is that clear? So the protocols for this is being laid down, the standard operating protocols or SOPs is being laid down by the National Crime Records Bureau, the NCRB, which is also under the Home Ministry. So NCRB will lay down the protocols on how the physical, biological samples, biometrics, DNA samples and facial profile will be collected, and at the level of police stations, the technology will be implemented to provide for DNA matching and face matching. So if accused are arrested, their basic samples will be collected and matched against the database, the existing database, to see whether they have been involved in any other cases across the country. So this could help in solving crime. It could help in improving security as well, right? The already existing fingerprint identification system, the National Automated Fingerprint Identification System or NAFIS, which is also under NCRB, will be interlinked with the DNA and facial matching systems. Is that clear? So this technology will be provided at the level of police stations by working with the concerned states and the state police. Now, however, this raises a concern, a privacy concern. In fact, when this law was enacted, opposition parties had strongly opposed the law because this could lead to misuse of personal data. The personal information related to biometrics, the DNA samples, the facial profiles, if it's in the wrong hands, if someone gets unauthorized access, it could be misused, it could breach privacy and could violate fundamental rights of the citizens. Especially if the accused are not held guilty eventually, right? If they are let off, or if the police have deliberately targeted innocent people and yet their basic details will be captured in the database, their fingerprints, their biometrics, iris retinal scans, their DNA samples, their facial profiles will be lodged in the database of NCRB, right? And potentially this can be misused in the future as well, leading to breach of privacy and violation of fundamental rights. So that concern remains, but however, the article says that the center is going ahead with the implementation of this identification system. Next, on page number 12, it has been reported that the Food Safety Standards Authority of India is mandating the companies, the food processing companies, to implement a QR code in food packaging. In the food material which is packed, the processed food items especially, I'm sure you would have seen a label where all the ingredients are listed, the nutritional value is listed out, and even the allergens are listed out, so that the consumer knows what they're consuming and you can make healthy choices. But right now, the food label which is there, it's all visual, right? But visually disabled people can't read or access the label, the packaged ingredients. They can't get to know as to what is there in the product. So the disability of the visually disabled is affecting them, limiting their access to information. Because see, equitable access to information is a fundamental right. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 mandates all government agencies to strive towards equal access to information for the disabled people as well. So visually disabled who can't read the labels on the food packet, they can't get to know what's the ingredients in the food item, what's the nutritional value, what are the allergens present. Correct? They can't even go through the expiry date. So to help them out, FSSAI is mandating a QR code along with the regular food label. The regular food label will remain as it is. The text-based visual label will be there. Along with that, a QR code will be added so that visually disabled can scan the QR code and use their phones to understand the ingredients, the nutritional composition, and the allergens and the expiry date. Correct? Today you have text-to-speech softwares on phones. So the phone can read out what is the ingredients, what's the nutritional value, what allergens are present, when's the expiry date. This ensures access to safe food for all and provides access to equitable information for the visually disabled as well, which is their fundamental right. Their right is also recognized under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. So this is another important development. Next, on the same page, we have an article referring to the Nallur Kandaswamy or Murugan temple in Jaffna in Sri Lanka. I feel it's an important topic under history, art and culture, and also international relations. The article refers to a former Indian diplomat who was deployed in Sri Lanka, and during Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2015, he points out that PM Modi could not visit this important shrine because of the strict dress code of the temple and the timings. It couldn't match with the PM's schedule. So as a result, PM Modi could not visit this important temple. Now this event is not important for us, but the temple itself is very important from the examination point of view. This is the temple, the Murugan temple. It's a very historic, very popular temple. It is extremely crucial for the Sri Lankan Tamil Hindu community. The Sri Lankan Tamils who are found in northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. The Murugan temple is extremely sacred. It's located at Nallur in Jaffna. That's why it's called Nallur Kandaswamy Kovil or the Nallur Murugan Kovil or temple. It is so important, it is such an integral part of Sri Lankan Tamil identity that similar Murugan temples are present around the world. Wherever Tamil diaspora is present, in Canada, in Europe, in UK, in US and Australia, across these countries, similar Murugan temples are present as it represents the cultural identity of the Sri Lankan Tamil Hindu community. This temple has a rich history in Jaffna. The current idol, the Lord Muruga idol which is there in this historic temple, was donated in the 10th century by Chola Queen Sembian Mahadevi. It's a bronze statue in the style of Sembian bronzes, which was a renowned feature of Chola art and culture. Is that clear? But its history predates this. The actual temple goes back to 948 AD, which was relocated because of various invasions, foreign invasions that would happen here. And eventually it has been built in a new location. From 13th to 15th century, it has been brought up at a new location by the Jaffna kings. Is that clear? These were Tamil kingdoms which were closely connected with the Indian subcontinent. So today, this temple here, the Murugan temple, stands as a symbol of cultural identity for the Sri Lankan Tamil community, and it forms a deep-rooted link between India and Sri Lanka as well. So that is something you should be aware of. Then coming to the last article. In the final page, that is page 2 of the online edition of the Hindu, there is a reference for the Badwater Basin salt flats that you can see here in this image. It's a spectacular topography in the United States, in California, in the Death Valley National Park. Now, why are these locations important? What is so unique about them? The Badwater salt basin, it's a salt flat, right? It's known for its high saline content. It's an endorheic lake. It's a completely landlocked basin in the Death Valley National Park. I hope you know the Death Valley is located in the Mojave Desert of California, in eastern California, and this is one of the hottest places on earth. There are reports that temperatures as high as 50 degrees to 56 degrees can be recorded here at the Death Valley, making it the hottest place on earth, and it's home to the Timshiba native tribe. They are the Native Americans found over here. So at this lowest point, right, the Death Valley National Park, you have the Badwater salt basins, which is an endorheic lake that is formed, which is indeed the lowest point here in continental North America. Not just in the US, across North America, this is the lowest point. It is 282 feet below sea level. So this endorheic lake is extremely saline. That's why there are salt flats located here. There is no life, no organisms present in this water body. All right, very few unique organisms can thrive here, but regular aquatic organisms cannot survive in such a hostile saline environment. Very few adapted organisms of flora and fauna can survive. And this is the lowest point here in North America, not just in the United States. And interestingly, it's located near the highest point in contiguous United States, which is Mount Whitney. So it's very interesting that in the Death Valley, you have both the lowest point in North America and also the highest point in continental US. So that is something you should be familiar with as part of basic global geography. So this completes my detailed discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. Let's end the session here today with the mains practice questions. It's all based on what we have covered, so please write an answer and post them in the answer rating portal for which the link has been given in the description box below. I hope you guys have liked today's session. Do let me know how it went in the comments. Do press the like button and share the video with other aspirants and subscribe to the channel. That is it for watching. We'll meet tomorrow again. Have a good day.